Hello everyone, and welcome to another exclusive event for subscribers of The Economist. I'm Zanny Minton Beddoes, the paper's editor-in-chief, and today we return to the war in Ukraine. Ukraine has retaken thousands of square miles of territory around Kharkiv, including the key city of Izium and the logistics hub of Kupiansk. Russian forces appear to have fled in disarray, leaving behind arms, equipment, and a mass burial site near Izium. Both America and the EU have reaffirmed their support for Ukraine, the former with $600 million of new aid, and the latter declaring in a speech by Ursula von der Leyen that supplying arms to Ukraine is, quote, absolutely vital, and that the EU's solidarity is unshakable. Here, as always, to discuss these events are my deputy, Ed Carr, our defense editor, Shashank Joshi, and our Russia editor, Arkady Ostrovsky, who is recently back from Kyiv. First, Shashank, let's turn to you with, the usual drill. Give us an update on the latest military situation. And I must say this, I'm looking forward to this one particularly because those maps of yours have seen tremendous movement.
Yeah, well, of course, maps of our fantastic cartographic team, to which all credit for these. I think that the most of our viewers by now will have read our stories, familiar with the broad contours of the news. They'll know what's happened in terms of the liberation of huge swaths of territory up in Kharkiv province in the northeast of Ukraine. So I'm not going to go into the details of that. I think let's just reflect on some of the consequences. And so we pull up the first map, the overall map of Ukraine. What I'd encourage is that we think about this as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The front is this long line. And if you think about the flanks, the northeastern flank and the western flank, one of them is the flank in Kharkiv, which has just been eliminated, it's collapsed, the Russian lines, and has fallen back. And the other flank in the southwest, which is the left flank in Kherson, is also under enormous pressure by the Ukrainians, where these Russian forces are being pressed up against the Dnieper River in the other Ukrainian offensive, which is moving much more slowly than the one in Kharkiv. I won't say all that much more about Kherson, other than the fact that I think it's not moving in the same way as the one in Kharkiv. The line's not collapsing, but Russian forces, I think, are in serious trouble. They're being denuded of ammunition. They can't get reinforcements over the river very easily. And you can see that little blue bulge around Suhy Stavok. You can see that kind of salient developing as the Ukrainians press in, putting those key bridges, particularly over Nova Kakhovka, over fire control. So they can effectively bring those bridges within reach, not just of HIMARS, rocket launchers, which are very long range, but also within range of their normal tube artillery systems of the kind they've been getting from America, France, and other countries. So that's Kherson. If we move on now to the east, our next map, I think the story here is that the Ukrainian offensive is broadly running out of steam. It's moving much more slowly. There have been no more major breakthroughs, but the Russians have tried to set a kind of defensive line along that river Oskil. And what's happened in the last few days is that the Ukrainians have crossed it. They've established some bridgeheads over the Oskil and are pursuing Ukrainian positions. And the really important stuff, I would say, in the last couple of days is the advances that we're seeing in the north of Donetsk province and the very edges of Luhansk province. So if you look at the bottom of the blue areas, you'll see these gains south of Izium. You'll see the gains south of Liman, and particularly you'll see that little blue blob, which is developing just north of Seversk. And what that is, it's Ukraine pressing into Luhansk province. Just yesterday, they took a settlement that's about a few kilometers west of Lysychansk, a few kilometers west of Severodonetsk. And if those names are familiar to us, Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, it's because we spent weeks debating them back in June, when Russia conquered them at enormous cost in men, enormous cost in manpower. It allowed Russia to claim that they had conquered the entirety of Luhansk province. And the major consequence of this offensive is that those places are now back under threat, and it's not clear whether Russia can hold on to them. And therefore, Russia's position in Donbass is under serious threat. And I think that brings us to some of the bigger political questions that we are going to be discussing today.
Thank you. That was really clear. And we're going to come to those in a second. But first, a couple more questions about maps and analysis. One is, what has actually allowed the Ukrainian armed forces to make such bold progress? We wrote in our editorial last week that Ukrainian forces have now shown that they're capable of daring, complex, maneuvers. But could you just give your assessment of what has really been the most important?
Well, Western weapons were absolutely vital. They couldn't have done it without these. And to give some specific examples, I would say HIMARS was absolutely essential to slowly taking out Russian ammunition stockpiles and air defense systems, but also something you may not have heard of called HARM, HARM. These are anti-radiation missiles, and they home in on the emissions of anything that radiates electromagnetic waves, which of course includes foremost radar, air defense radar. And by taking those air defense radar out, it made it far more difficult for Russia to take out Ukrainian drones that were then able to fly over Kharkiv. The other really important thing was Ukrainian air defense systems of their own. And in fact, Ukrainian commanders singled out to us the effectiveness of German anti-aircraft guns. Germany has got a very bad rap in the last few months over the failure to provide sufficient numbers of weapons to Ukraine. But Ukrainians say these guns are working really well, and they're making it difficult for Russia to put its own drones over the sky of these places. So Western weapons have been absolutely essential. Western ammunition has been essential because offensives are really demanding on ammunition, as I said, of Russian offensives earlier this year, and as I reiterate, of Ukrainian offensives. But I think if I'm picking out one thing that really enabled this offensive, it's the Ukrainian ability to find a weak spot in the Russian lines. And they didn't get lucky. They made their own luck. By pressing the Russians in Kherson, they forced the Russians to push some of their best units, the VDV airborne forces, to the south. That opened up gaps in the lines in the north, and that's what they exploited so ruthlessly with surprise and mobility. And I think if Ukraine is going to make advances like this again, lightning advances that break through very deep and penetrate, tens of kilometers behind the front lines, it's going to need to force the Russians to move troops about in this way, creating these similarly vulnerable points that can be exploited. That's going to be the key to Ukrainian advances in the next several months.
Thank you, Shashank. Well, with that, Arkady, let's turn to you, because I think the next obvious question is, what impact does this reversal of fortune have on Putin's strategy in Ukraine?
I think it has a really massive political impact and a social and cultural impact inside Russia. For the first time, the penny dropped amongst the Russian elite, amongst the Russian population at large, that Putin is not invincible. Now, this is really important. The idea that Putin could lose was quite alien to a lot of people. His entire legitimacy rested on the idea that he is lucky, that he always wins, that he is strong, and he knows what he is doing. This retreat, which is the largest retreat that he had faced in 22 years in power, that includes his wars in Chechnya, his war in Georgia, his war in Syria, is a very, very serious blow to his reputation and to that image of victorious Putin. That itself has a big implication on how politics develop, because remember, we've been saying from day one that there's been no popular demand for this war. Yes, there are a lot of people who are supporting it, acquiescing to it, but to say that the Russian population wanted this war would be completely untrue. And the war is not a popular thing in any country, Russia included. This is already sort of dropping it in a sort of environment where people are starting to have doubts, people seeing that he actually could be weak. It's a moment when things can change and start unravel.
Thank you, Arkady. Well, we will turn more to the political consequences with Moscow later. But Ed, before we move on from the actual counteroffensive and its consequences directly, what's your sense of how this has been viewed in Europe and in the US? I mean, it in many ways, President Zelensky needed a military advance, needed to show success. Is this proof that the military aid that's been pouring in has been put to good use, and will it persuade others, notably Germany, to offer more assistance?
Well, I think it was important. As you said, there was a story going around that this was just a stalemate and nothing could really change. And Zelensky, we know, was very, very keen for there to be progress. He was pressing his generals to try and throw all their resources into an attack through the center of that land bridge. And instead this happened. But so that's kind of a sense that, yes, it's demonstrated Ukraine really can make progress. But there's a couple of other things have happened that this very helpfully for the Ukrainians just reinforces. And the first of those is the fall in natural gas prices that a month ago were almost getting up towards almost $350 and are now down safely below $185. That's a big fall in a month, and that makes everything easier. At the same time, the build-up of stocks of gas are now getting up above 85% of their target for the end of October, so they're ahead on that. And in Germany, Chancellor Scholz is showing increasing signs of feeling confident that Germany can get through the winter. So that's helped. Also, I think a very interesting indicator of where the Europeans are now is that almost unnoticed recently, they extended the Russian sanctions for another 6 months to March next year. That was virtually not noticed in the news because actually there was a surprising amount of unanimity, a little bit of fuss by Hungary, that was overcome very quickly. So Putin's strategy to use energy to try and push Europe into a situation where it needed peace, I think has kind of signally failed at the same time as this advance in Ukraine. And that's highly significant. It just puts more pressure on him. He's now cut exports through Nord Stream 1 entirely. There's some Russian gas coming in through the south into Greece, not a huge amount. That means the gas weapon is more or less being used up now, and I think it's failed to do its job.
Thank you. Shashank, a few questions on military matters directly from our subscribers. A question from Stefan, who asks, would modern NATO tanks such as the Abrams or the Leopard 2 make much of a difference for Ukraine going forward? And why are Western allies hesitating?
I think it's a fascinating question because what we've seen in recent days is Germany and German officials say that we're under unfair criticism for not providing tanks. They haven't said the word escalation, but they've implied it would be an escalation. And it's a funny thing because, of course, Ukraine has received lots of tanks. It's received old Soviet-era tanks from Poland, from Slovakia, from the Czech Republic. I think I may have forgotten some others in that list. But they've received tanks. Is it so fundamentally different to receive a Western tank? I think the distinction in escalatory terms is pretty meaningless because it's not really the origin of a tank. It's who's in the compartment, who's driving it. If you gave modern American or British tanks to a Russian tank crew, I fully imagine they would show the same insipid, uncreative approach that has led to them losing hundreds of tanks in 7 months. Whereas if you gave them a Ukrainian crew modern tanks, they'd be very effective with them. I do think there is a distinction, however, in terms of giving them certain types of tanks, which is maintenance and logistics. For example, an American M1A1 Abrams tank is, I'm told, extremely thirsty in terms of fuel. So that would create enormous burdens on Ukrainian crews to get fuel to the tank. Could they sustain that in the sort of operations they're conducting? Would they have been able to get fuel 80, 90 kilometers through Kharkiv province in the same way if they were operating American tanks? And the other one is maintenance. These are people who have used and operated Soviet-designed tanks for their entire careers. They know how the inside of a T-72 works, even if it's a Polish T-72 that's been modernized and has NATO electronics on the inside. Would they know how to repair the tracks or the electronics or the sights on a German Leopard tank? I think that's a fair question. But the tide is turning, and I think Western officials are now realizing this is an army that needs to be supported over many months, potentially over many years. And I think at some point soon we will see Western tanks go to Ukraine, but that psychological burden is still there. But if you're willing to give them HIMARS rocket launchers, advanced air defense systems, being unwilling to give them Western tanks just doesn't make any sense.
One other question, which is also related, from Andrew, one of our viewers. He asks, how is the training of Ukrainian troops going in the UK and in the EU? And will it allow them to refresh their frontline troops more quickly than Russia? And actually, I might add to that, would it make it easier for them then to use the kind of equipment you're talking about?
We have to divide training into two sorts, Zanny, and one of them is specialist training on things like HIMARS or specific units, and that's very small scale. And that, of course, if you want to operate M777 howitzers or French Caesar artillery or German Gepard anti-aircraft guns, you need specialist training. And a lot of that has gone on and is still going on, and you cannot give them those systems without any of that training. It must be done. What's happening in the UK is slightly different, and it's actually more important in some ways because it's basic training. It's taking your average Ukrainian who may have been conscripted or voluntarily signed up with no military experience. And indeed, my colleagues who have been to see training in the UK, they said 90% of the Ukrainians there have no prior military experience. So there, you're not training them how to use a NLAW or Javelin missile. You're training them how do you pick up a gun, aim it, and fire it straight. How do you treat your colleague if they've been hit by shrapnel? Very basic stuff, but absolutely essential if Ukraine is to make use of its manpower advantage and turn it into usable units. My understanding is they've trained several thousand people already who've already gone back to Ukraine. There's many more in the pipeline. This is vital to allowing Ukraine to generate the extra brigades that it needs to conduct offensives like the one in Kharkiv. But I see no sign at present that this is happening at scale outside the UK, which is a real problem. There are some conversations going on about the EU setting up a training program. That's at a very early stage. There are other conversations going on about a division of labour. So, for example, the UK might do a basic training. Another country might do more advanced training for units, putting these raw recruits into battalions. Another country might do air defence. As far as I understand it, and I may be a few weeks behind on this, that hasn't progressed particularly quickly. But if we are going to see bigger Ukrainian offensives over the next 6 months, that has to happen. And I think that's the area where the EU, NATO, the West really has to accelerate its efforts.
Thank you. Very clear. Arkady, let's now turn to you and get the view from Kyiv. You're just back from a trip to Ukraine. Give us a sense of what's the mood like among the people you spoke to. I think you were there the very weekend that this lightning advance took place. So was it what was the mood like then, and what's the mood like now? I know you're talking to people regularly.
Yes, I was there. I was there that very weekend. I was part of the conference which was organized by Viktor Pinchuk, the YES conference, the Ukraine's European strategy. There were a lot of foreign political celebrities, politicians, military people. And what was very striking is that the mood in the room of the conference, which, as I said, included military people and politicians from the West, the supporters and the friends of Ukraine, was almost euphoric. This was Ukraine already sort of having, already won the war, if you like. And there was a very interesting contrast between that and the mood on the streets and amongst people I spoke to in Ukrainian media, the people inside the government. And the mood was the one of sobriety and composure, which in itself, I think, was a big encouragement. Nobody there was sort of celebrating this victory, partly because there's been a effective media blackout. The army and the government have asked reporters not to speculate, not to talk about. There's been a ban effectively on spreading the information until it's completely verified. And people completely accepted that. I think there is a sense of this is not going to be over next week or even in a few months' time. And there is a sense of determination, obviously people drawing a lot of comfort from this advance, but holding things together, not sort of going and jumping up and down the streets. So on the whole, I would say that the mood was the one of composure, and I think that's a good thing.
Thank you. Ed, can I turn to you now? Because much of what you do is to think about how to judge these developments and haul back those of us who are prone to great enthusiasm to be more sober in the analysis. And so I wanted to get your sense of how important this moment is, how important momentum is at a moment like this. Can it be maintained? Are you, I guess, given Arkady's description, more with the caution of the people on the streets of Ukraine or the euphoria in that conference he was at?
So the good news, first of all, I feel really encouraged that Ukraine's demonstrated that it can take territory. That is a necessary but not sufficient condition for this to all end up well. I'm also hugely reassured that one of my big worries early this year, that Europe particularly would buckle, I don't think that's going to happen now. I think in a way the perverse consequence of Putin's strategy of trying to show Europe that the consequences of sticking with Ukraine would be terrible have actually rebounded on him, and they've just demonstrated the consequences of not standing up to Vladimir Putin would be terrible in the longer run. The thing that now I'm really thinking hard about is the sort of third front of this war, and that's the front within Russia. Because ultimately, I think this war ends when Vladimir Putin or those around him decide that this is futile. It's going nowhere. Young men and women are being killed. Battles being fought. They're making no progress. They're losing ground. They're a pariah. They can't get on with their lives. The medium to long-term outlook for the economy is awful. So I'm thinking really hard at the moment about how this is playing within Moscow. And that's why what Arkady said first of all at the beginning of this conversation, Zanny, is what struck me so much, which is this sort of crack in the invulnerability of Vladimir Putin. And what we're seeing today, I think with this press conference, with the calling of referendums in the next few days in Donetsk and Luhansk, in order to sort of annex them to Russia, is his response. And I have to say, we should debate what we think that response means. But to me, it says he's very much acting from a position of weakness.
Hold that thought, because we are going to get to it and debate that. But just before we do, Shashank, I just want to hear your sense of what's next for the Ukrainian armed forces. You wrote a cover, you were part of the cover package we wrote just recently. And for those of you watching on screen, you can see the QR code that can take you straight there. Getting the job done. None of you bears responsibility for that. That was me, so I take full responsibility for that. How do the Ukrainians think? How far do you think they can go, Shashank? Are we talking pre-2014 borders? You know, how far is this going to go?
I was reflecting on this earlier this morning, and I thought, when I talk to experts these days, the foremost experts on Russia's armed forces and Russia's military and in the conflict, more and more I sense confidence and optimism about Ukraine's prospects. More often I hear the phrase, Ukraine can win next year. And there's a sense that Kharkiv has allowed them to say that, allowed them to be more confident in offering that. And I've been very hesitant to sort of reach that conclusion, because I know how difficult it is. And it is worth stressing the conditions in Kharkiv with, for example, militia from the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, these two sort of sham puppet regimes Russia's established. Those militia were guarding the border along with Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard. They weren't crack forces. A lot of those better units are in Kherson in the south, where Ukraine hasn't had a breakthrough. So what I'm trying to get at is that Ukraine faces tougher conditions in other parts of the front. Better defenses, trenches, fortifications, more experienced troops, more motivated troops. But it can recreate the conditions it found in Kharkiv by forcing Russia, which has a huge manpower problem, a serious manpower problem, not enough troops to hold this 1,000-kilometer front, to force them to move those forces around. And eventually, there will be weak points that recur. There will be weak points that recur. And I think as you move over the next several months, and particularly look forward to spring, where there'll be more weapons, there'll be more trained Ukrainians, the Russians will be demoralized, having spent the winter in rainy, wet, miserable conditions, having taken substantial casualties. I think that creates significant opportunities for Ukraine to take back huge chunks of territory. Now, on the distinction between pre-February 24th and post-February 24th, I know it's a distinction we talk about a lot, and we should. But I just would inject a note of caution, which is to say that there's no logical geographic demarcation here, of course, right? Any Ukrainian army that is strong enough to break through Russian lines and, for example, sever the land bridge, which goes from Donbass to Crimea, any Ukrainian army that can get that far and causes a collapse in Russian lines to that degree is going to be one that fundamentally threatens Russia in its pre-February 24th boundaries on Russian-occupied territory. There's no way to calibrate that kind of movement. You can sort of hold back ammunition from the Ukrainians. You could tell them not to proceed. But if they have broken Russian lines and have broken past, let's say, Zaporizhia and Melitopol and are pushing south, it's not going to be an easy distinction to preserve under those circumstances. And I do think Western officials are a little bit anxious about that.
You're absolutely right. It's clearly militarily, if the momentum is there to get to the February line, then why not go further? But there are consequences. And briefly, Arkady, if it came to it, how easy would it be to reintegrate Luhansk and Donetsk back into Ukraine? And secondly, Philip, one of our viewers asks, how much pro-Russian population will remain in the east if Ukraine reclaims those territories?
That's a very good question. Look, this areas under occupation, the territories, the Donetsk and Luhansk, have been part of the Russian media space, or being brainwashed, bombarded with Russian propaganda, coerced by the local militias for 8 years. Obviously, that has had an impact. One important thing to remember, that actually in the number of people who stayed in those areas who originally lived there is something possibly as low as 20%. If Ukraine manages to take those territories back and bring back the population of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions who were there prior to Russian occupation in 2014, I think they will have an overwhelming say, and I think they will have a much greater sense of power and authority there. And I think a lot of the militias would simply run away. I don't see it as an insurmountable problem as long as that population can be relocated back. We're a very long way from that. Also, we don't actually know what the mood is in Donetsk. We haven't been able to, and Western reports have not been able to travel, obviously, to the occupied territory for some time now. From what we hear on social media, from sort of secondhand reports, is that people are also very frustrated because also what they've seen for the past 6 months is, on the one hand, Russia saying, we recognize your independence and Russia will stand with you. And yet the bombardments continue and they intensify. And a lot of men who've been grabbed off the streets from their houses, from the, going around to buy a loaf of bread in the shop and being sent to the front as cannon fodder. So, we've seen scenes of fighters, so-called volunteers in Donetsk refusing to go and fight for the neighboring country or Republic of Luhansk because they know they're now facing a fierce Ukrainian army. It's not something that is very entrenched, and certainly if you can bring back the displaced population, which is millions of people, I think things could revert back very quickly.
Thank you. Let's stick with you now, Arkady, and turn to Russia and what we make of what's going on there, what we understand to be happening, and what its consequences will be. So first of all, it was clear that following Russian losses in Kharkiv, there was criticism of the war from inside Russia. And Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov offered to go and tell the Russian leadership what's really going on the ground. And now more recently, we have news that, as I said earlier, Vladimir Putin is going to address the Russian people later today. Arkady, give us the Russian equivalent of Shashank's sitrep. Tell us what is going on in Russia right now.
Russia is a sort of a black box in a way, in terms of public opinion and in terms of interpreting their public opinion and what's happening within the elite. Because there is fear, this is abnormal situation. You can't apply the same methods of measuring public opinion as you can do in a free society. People answer differently because they're under coercion. So that's one important thing to remember. And that's why we always say that these regimes are very brittle, because it's hard to pierce into them. It's hard to see when it's coming, but we know they are brittle. And I completely agree with that Putin at the moment is acting out of sense of weakness and almost a desperation. What happened after the Ukrainian counter-offensive in Kharkiv and in the south was this sense of things are unraveling, because as I said at the beginning, there was suddenly this veneer of invincibility has been shattered. And I think people have understood, and the elites understood, was this moment, Putin loves Kipling's The Jungle Book in the Mowgli. And there is a line there, when a leader of the pack has missed his kill, he is called the dead wolf. As long as he lives, which is not very long as a rule. And in a way, Putin is not a dead wolf yet, but he's certainly a wounded one. And the criticism was coming at him from two sides. One, it was coming from the sort of militant, ultra-nationalist, really sort of zealots, crazed, possessed by this war, commentators, militias, people like Ramzan Kadyrov, people like Igor Strelkov, some of those irregulars who led the offensive in 2014, some of the sort of super ultra-nationalist writers saying this is not a real, it's time to call this a war. Enough is enough. This is not a special military operation. Call military, mobilization, destroy the infrastructure, nuke them, sort of go the whole hog and stop holding back. So that's one and very vocal group of critics, if you like, or those who encourage Putin to go further. In terms of how much support they have in the population at large, our estimates And I won't bore you with how we arrived at that, but there are several measures of how we can try to estimate that, is about 15 to 20% of the population who actually support the continuing of the war despite the losses and despite the cost to themselves. They tend to be older people over the age of 60. They're the television viewers, they're the ones who've been bombarded with the propaganda. There is another and possibly bigger camp of people who actually oppose the war, the 35% of the population. These are the supporters of Alexei Navalny. These are the people who were out in the streets when he was arrested after being poisoned. They've been obviously less vocal because they've been repressed, because they can't get out of the street, because they've been censored. And in a way, Putin allowing the first camp, the militant camp, to speak is to drown out their voices. And then there is the middle ground, the 50, 60% of the population, which is sort of listening to signals from both sides. And what was very interesting, Zanny, is that the signal came from possibly Russia's and Soviet most popular person in the immediate aftermath of Russia's defeat on the battleground. Alla Pugacheva, who is Russian pop diva, probably the most famous person over the past 60 years in pop culture. Sort of Russian Frank Sinatra, Veroline, Beatles, sort of all rolled into one. A real icon. And, about whom it jokes used to be made that Leonid Brezhnev was a minor political figure in the era of Alla Pugacheva. And she suddenly, she came back to Russia having spent time outside, and she wrote and published a post opposing the war, saying this is leading Russia to be a pariah into isolation. This is costing lives. It was a real shock, I think, to the system, and the public does tune into that, what it's looking for various signals. So I think this is partly what's driving Putin, is that sense of the public opinion possibly unraveling, the criticism from the right wanting more, and the need to show that he can double down, that he's not a dead wolf yet. That's what's driving him now in the side of desperation at the time when Russia is actually losing ground to call for referendums to annex territory, to get what he can, and to apply more draconian rules in terms of coercion towards partial mobilization to reinforce his troops. So he is not in a good place. And very interestingly, Ukrainians are actually being quite, not only calm, but saying this is a good thing, because this is Putin's escalation will further radicalize and split Russia and will further destabilize it politically.
Thank you. I'm trying to get my head around one person being the Beatles, Vera Lynn, and Frank Sinatra all together. Could you give us a sense of what you are expecting in this address that Vladimir Putin is going to give? Is there anything that our viewers should be looking out for, and what is it going to be a sign of?
This is going to be his response to the offense, Ukrainian offense. They've staged this sort of choreographed and staged this appeals by Donetsk and Luhansk republics, as well as the Zaporizhia and Kherson, the occupied territories, to hold these referendums, which will start on the 23rd of September. That's in 3 days' time, so they're in a real rush. The Russian propaganda I've been watching quite closely over the past few days has been focusing on the fact that Ukrainians have been hitting these territories with underlined American armor, the 155 caliber shells. This is NATO troops. The rhetoric has changed on Russian television, saying, okay, this is serious. This is not just Ukraine. We're under attack from NATO. And NATO armor is very serious. So I think Putin will say several things: that the West has escalated this war, that NATO is now a threat to Russia, that it's Russia's duty to defend the people against the terrorist or terrorist-sponsoring regime in Ukraine, and therefore he agrees with all these good-willing people in Donetsk, Luhansk, and in his own parliament who are calling for joining those territories to Russian Federation. This actually will mean very little in practice. The thing to watch for is whether he calls for martial law or partial mobilization. Now, there are various ways of hiding that. Putin has a problem. He cannot, it's very difficult for him, having conducted the special military operation, not a war, having punished people for saying the word, to suddenly turn to the country and say, okay, this has failed, now let's call it a war and let's draft everybody immediately, including your only child in the family at the age of 16 or 17. He's not going to do that. But he might call some special rule, partial mobilization, which basically, and this is what the amendments made by the Russian parliament in a hurry today were about. They introduced a number of coercive measures, changes to the criminal code of Russia, saying that if you refuse to serve when called upon, if you surrender voluntarily, you face a criminal charge and a prison sentence. This will then allow Putin possibly to go after reservists. This is people who already had their military service, who are there in the 20s and 30s, and coerce them by offering possibly a bit of money, but also threatening prison sentences if they refuse to serve. So watch out for any words on martial law, on mobilization. At the same time, watch out for what he is going to say in terms of him offering Ukraine a way out, because I think he will say that this was not Russia's idea to start this war. This is all Ukraine and NATO, that he wants to end it. He wants people to live in peace. This is what he said to Xi Jinping. This is what he's been saying to Erdogan, that this is time to stop, and Russia is willing to stop it. This will be a message particularly to Scholz and Macron, to France and Germany, saying it's time for you, European countries, to talk sense into Vladimir Zelensky, to start negotiating on some peace settlement.
Thank you. Well, you've raised a lot there, and I'm going to come back to the escalation risk in a second, Shashank, with you. But first, Ed, I wanted to ask you about the reaction beyond Russia, because it was telling that last week at a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a kind of economics and security forum in Central Asia, Putin addressed the war in public talks, both with Xi Jinping and with Narendra Modi. And he was told by Narendra Modi, and I quote, "I know that today's era is not an era of war, and I have spoken to you on the phone about this." And for an Indian leader, that is quite direct language. And while speaking, I think, with Xi Jinping, Putin himself said, "We understand your questions and concerns about the war." Again, pretty clearly saying, I messed up. I think that would be the interpretation I would put on it. How much should one read into those exchanges? And are they a sign that India and China may be losing patience with Vladimir Putin?
Well, the choreography was very interesting. One of my colleagues sent me a picture of Putin in a group of leaders, and rather than sitting at the high chair, which was for Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a Turkish president who was sort of holding court, Putin looked rather uncomfortable on a sofa, sandwiched between two other leaders, looking rather small. So, perhaps that was an accident. I suspect it wasn't. He came across as a slightly diminished figure, and he would have been very aware of that. However, the key issue here, I think, is China, and I don't think we should let those small signs of discontent kind of run away with ourselves. China doesn't mind it if Russia's not doing incredibly well in the war, because it makes Russia more dependent on China. It makes China able to buy Russian natural resources at a better rate. Equally, China would be perfectly happy if Russia did very well in the war, because it would humiliate the West. I have yet to be convinced that China wants to see Russia actually defeated. I think that would be a setback for China, if only because Xi Jinping himself has a relationship with Putin, and before the war started, they swore their undying friendship and brotherhood, and Xi Jinping's coming up to a party congress very soon, in which he will be nominated for an unprecedented third time as the party leader. So it would be an embarrassment for Xi Jinping if Putin were to suffer an abject failure. I don't see China putting enormous pressure on Russia at the moment. I just think it reflects the fact in this sort of dog-eat-dog world of autocrats that Putin's stake has gone down somewhat.
And what about the other smaller allies reconsidering their position? Kazakhstan, I think, has distanced itself from the war now. Is this sort of immaterial, or is this all part of the same drumbeat.
It's really interesting. And just in this past few weeks, we've had a flare-up of the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which now the Americans have come in as the brokers. So Blinken is talking at the moment, trying to sort out a peace. Nancy Pelosi was involved. And, that is also a rebuke to Putin, because if you remember last time these two countries were fighting, it was Putin who was the peacemaker. And then there's a Kyrgyz and Tajik flare-up as well, two former Soviet countries, which again sort of shows you that Putin's distracted. And Xi Jinping was also quite careful to go into Kazakhstan and just demonstrate that he's perhaps rather important there, because if you remember, Putin had intervened in an uprising in Kazakhstan not so long ago, just before the war. He sort of demonstrated again he was I think it was just after the war, where Putin demonstrated he was the peacemaker. So in Russia's periphery, you see sort of signs of weakness, and that will not be being missed by the security elite inside Russia. It's all signs of sort of diminishing influence. And I think, what we're going to see today is a response by Putin to these increasing signs that he's on the defensive.
Thank you. Arkady, what do you make of these sort of flare-ups in the periphery? How do you read it the same way that Ed does?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. So while this big war is going on in Ukraine, we've also had two flare-ups. One in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where Azerbaijan, with Turkey's backing, started advancing on Armenia, trying to get it to acknowledge the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, that exclave which the two countries have been fighting for years. And also there's been a flare-up on the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, two Central Asian countries, which are part of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. Now, what's very interesting is that Armenia is, of course, backed by Russia. Armenia is part and the main client of something called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, which is Russia's response to sort of its remnants of Warsaw Pact, if you like. But Armenia is very dependent on Russia's backing, both in terms of energy and in terms of arms. And Armenia has been appealing for Russia to stop Azerbaijan, and Russia is really unable to do that. Russia cannot give it arms because it needs it itself. Meantime, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic Speaker, has gone to Armenia, saying, okay, this is ahead of the midterms, and this is, could be interpreted as, helping to get the votes of Armenian diaspora in America, but actually has gone to Armenia to say, America can help you. We can stop Azerbaijan. We can look after you. And this is a big slap in the face of Russia. It's sort of the exposing its impotence, humiliating it, saying America can step into the Caucasus as well and talk to Turkey. Iran has also been quite assertive in that part of the world, saying there should be no forced change of borders in the Caucasus. And suddenly Russia is sitting completely on the fence, and this is, of course, part of the former Soviet and former Russian Empire. Equally, in the Central Asia, it's China that is calling the shots. China has basically invested heavily in Tajikistan. It owns Tajik infrastructure. The government buildings were donated by the Chinese. The Ministry of Defense is answering, the answer phone actually answers, when I was there a few years ago, answered in Chinese. Again, it's China that will be calling the shots, not Russia. So when the empires go, the periphery starts to show it.
Well, you've certainly made clear that Vladimir Putin has problems, not just his very large problem with his special military operation, but also increasingly on the periphery. Let's now turn in the few minutes we've got left to a big subject we've touched on, but I'd like to get all of your views on, which is one we've talked about before in previous such conversations, namely the risk of escalation. Arkady, you laid out how we might think about any words coming from Vladimir Putin today. You described the small but very vocal minority of hardliners in Russia calling for escalation. Meanwhile, on Sunday in America, Joe Biden said on an interview for CBS's 60 Minutes that the use of nuclear or chemical weapons against Ukraine would prompt, quote, a consequential response from America. Shashank, what do you make of all this? How should we think about the possibility, indeed the risk of further escalation?
I mean, in the first phase of war, Zanny, a lot of our concerns about escalation were to do with NATO-Russia escalation. For example, Russia striking arms convoys in Poland or somewhere else, causing a bigger conflagration that led to a nuclear exchange. Our concerns now are more narrow. They're about Russia losing, and out of desperation to avert a loss, making coercive use of nuclear weapons. That is, conducting a small demonstration strike or an attack on a Ukrainian base, perhaps over the Black Sea, using tactical nuclear weapons, which are typically shorter range weapons, typically of lower yield, a few kilotons. For reference, the Hiroshima weapon was about 15 kilotons, in order to shock Ukraine into submission and shock the West into ending the conflict on terms favorable to Russia. I just want to give a slightly more specific twist on that, which connects this conversation to the conversation about annexation of Donbass and these referenda that Arkady described. Because if the territories in Donbass and Luhansk were to hold referenda, if they were to be annexed formally by Russia, even if no one else formally recognized those places as part of Russia, and of course we wouldn't, they would be sham referenda. Nonetheless, the Kremlin would say that Ukrainian offensives of the kind I described right at the beginning of this webinar, including on places like Lysychansk and around that area, would constitute attacks on Russian soil. And of course, Russian nuclear doctrine allows for nuclear responses to attacks on Russian soil, or indeed attacks that are seen as existentially threatening to the Russian state. That would therefore allow the Kremlin to say that these Ukrainian offensives are potentially going to cause a nuclear response, which is something that they have said of Crimea. And we saw that from Dmitry Medvedev, a former Russian president, in July. And it would be a way of trying to forestall these Ukrainian offensives. Now, I don't think that would work. Ukraine's not going to roll over just because Russia talks about nuclear weapons. But I think it will immediately add to nuclear risk in this conflict. And I think it will send jitters through Western capitals. And of course, that is precisely the aim that Vladimir Putin wants. So I think that the risk, while still low, is going to be uncomfortably higher than it was if we see formal annexation of these territories into Russia.
Thank you. That's really interesting and rather sobering. Ed, how do you see the escalation risk now?
So I think what's going to happen tonight is that Putin is going to try and redefine the aims of the war, to try and define them in such a way that he thinks he can succeed. And I completely follow Shashank's logic. But if I take it one step further and you think, well, okay, let's imagine that Putin actually goes so far as to explode a battlefield nuclear weapon. I don't know at this point what that really gets him. I think the threat might get him somewhere in the sense that it might, as Arkady was mentioning earlier, it might lead some European leaders to try and lean on the Ukrainians not to advance, but I don't think that would succeed. It might before anything's done, but once you've exploded a weapon, I just don't see really where that gets you. And so I'm thinking it's, he may use that as a threat, but I'm not certain how effective it will really be. Instead, I think what's going to happen is he's going to try and turn the tables again so that the sense that time is on Ukraine's side, which is kind of where we are, where this whole conversation has had it. Ukraine has the benefit in manpower. Ukraine is getting more weapons. Ukraine has momentum. Ukraine has morale. All of those things, and indeed, Russia in the medium term, its economy gets worse. The gas weapons being used. The whole sense at the moment is that in this long war, Ukraine now has the advantage of the clock, and that's absolutely crucial. And I think his attempt will be to try and redefine the war through a combination of territorial ambition and hints at mobilization and hints at the use of nuclear weapons to try and say, you know what, I'm in this for the keeps. I'm going to stick at this. And you think that you've got time on your side. I've got time on my side. I'm going to see this through.
Arkady, to you, how do you think the risk of escalation is now viewed in Kyiv? What's your sense of hearing both Shashank and Ed?
I agree actually with both, but I particularly agree with Ed. I think that's very much my sense as well. let's just make one step back. Of course, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and put nuclear submarines and put the air defenses, etc., that was Putin's mantra. This is now Russian territory. You try to cross that red line, we've got nuclear arms. Now, if you look at the past few weeks, the reason that Ukraine, and this was the word, that was the explanation that I heard in Kyiv, the reason Ukraine has been hitting at Russian bases in Crimea, including in Sevastopol, the home to Russian Black Sea Fleet, with not just permission, but I think encouragement almost of its Western backers in America, is to test that line. And they were doing it in preparation precisely for the event, which I think we're about to see, the sham referenda and annexation. Because what Ukraine wanted to show is, look, this means nothing. There are no red lines in that sense. And if we could actually reach into Crimea, then we certainly can reach into Crimea, which a lot of Russians considered historically part of their country. Certainly, we can continue to advance in Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia and Kherson. And that was precisely what these operations were designed to do. This said, I also take Shashank's point. Look, Russia is a nuclear power. Putin cannot lose. And this actually brings us, I think, me certainly in my thinking, back to where we started. On the one hand, Putin cannot lose because it is the end of his regime. On the other hand, Russia is a nuclear power, vast territory. It cannot be occupied in the same way as Nazi Germany was at the end of the Second World War. And that means that whatever change comes, I think will have to come from within. Ukraine advance will be very important, but in fact, since the world is not going to be safe with Putin in charge of Russia, the unraveling would have to happen inside, just as it happened at the end of the First World War, when the German high command understood that the best way to undermine the Tsarist regime was by stirring discontent there, and that's what happened. And I think that brings us back to the question of domestic Russian politics, which Putin is about to destabilize, I think, further.
Thank you. That's a huge canvas you've just opened there. I think we'll have another whole session on that. We are running out of time, but I want to ask one quick question of Shashank and then one of all of you. The quick question is, we've had several viewers ask about Iranian drones. Owen in particular asks, how much difference will the Iranian drones make?
So the Iranians have sent a drone called the Shahed 136 that the Russians have renamed the Geran, and it's been showing up in large numbers. And it's what we call a loitering munition, a drone that sort of flies around and then has a kamikaze effect by slamming into the target. The warhead's about 80 pounds, so quite substantial amount of explosives in there. And it has had an effect. From what we've seen from Ukrainian accounts, it has caused some damage to armor, soft-skin vehicles, and it's like many new weapons that appear on the battlefield, it surprises commanders. They don't have time to adapt. It takes time to adapt. What I think it emphasizes to me is that drones, including munitions like this, have made a substantial impact in Ukraine, but under some conditions. It depends on air defenses, it depends on electronic warfare, it depends on tactics, and all of those things are adaptable. So really, as long as Ukraine has an adequate supply of air defenses, and I discuss the importance of that capability in enabling the Kharkiv offensive, they can cope with this. If they don't, and they struggle with it, they're going to take very, very heavy losses. The fact is, this conflict has seen such severe casualties in part because no side has air supremacy. The airspace is contested, and that is what in many cases has resulted in this kind of vulnerability on both sides.
Thank you. Well, this hour has flown by, as they always do, and I am really struck by how different the mood of the three of you is than the conversation we had just a couple of months ago when it felt like a stalemate, and now suddenly no longer a stalemate. But I'm not going to extrapolate too much from that because I've learned in the last more than 6 months that these things change. But I am going to ask you each, I'm tempted to ask you a fantastic question by Doug, but I fear we'd need another hour. Doug asked, how does this end and what will need to happen to secure the peace? But I'm not going to make you answer that in 30 seconds each, but instead in 20 seconds each. When we look back at this entire episode, will the last 2 weeks be seen as a meaningful turning point? It's basically a yes/no question of each of you. Ed first.
Yes, I think it will. And the reason is it's the moment when that necessary condition for Ukrainian success was demonstrated, and that is that Ukraine can make breakthroughs on the battlefield. And it's sort of demonstrated through that its tactical abilities, the value of Western weapons and what difference they make, its superior morale, and good generalship. And with all of those things, you get advances on the battlefield. And the things that I'll be just 2 seconds more, the things that Arkady talked about at the end of sort of this ultimately being settled in Moscow, the condition for that is battlefield success, Western support, and then finally, the final piece is sort of realization in Moscow that this is a futile war. But it all starts with battlefield success, and that's what we've seen.
Thank you. Arkady, will this be seen as a turning point?
It's a turning point. The question is turning point to what? I mean, it's definitely a very important stage. It's not just an episode. It's not going to be offset. Never predict the future. I mean, obviously, I would hope this is kind of a Stalingrad moment after which the will to continue this melts away. The Russian soldiers are demoralized, burnt out. We're seeing our colleagues, Oleg Carroll, who's reporting from Ukraine, doing a great job. He's seen some letters left by Russian soldiers, how they're morally and physically completely exhausted. So, yes, a turning point. What Vladimir Putin does next, look, Ed and I were in Moscow just before the war was started. We thought that he would not do it because it would be so catastrophic and it would be such extraordinary blunder. It was a blunder. It was catastrophic, and he made this mistake. So there could be other mistakes. I hope the course of history does put everything right, and I very much hope that Ed is right. But it's certainly a very important inflection moment in the war.
Thank you. And Shashank, the last word is yours.
Yeah, sorry to be boring. I agree. It psychologically shows what Ukraine can do. It pretty much ends Russia's aspirations to conquer Donbass by force, which was the formal animating purpose of this conflict. And I think that it really spells the end of major offensive operations by Russia. And indeed, even if they mobilize, even that I don't think will create for them new offensive opportunities to do what they attempted to do back in February. So I do think this is a turning point. But of course, it may be many, many more months before we actually see decisive results. And I think Arkady's comparison of Stalingrad is both chilling, but also in some ways illuminating for us in that respect.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. On the same page, you can also find recordings of previous events, including a discussion of how President Xi Jinping has influenced China. See you next time.